Well, good afternoon and welcome to our RSK Biocensus First Thursday Club for October. I'm Gavin Wilson, I'm a director in RSK Biocensus, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by my colleague Robin Jones, who's going to present on the challenges of managing reptiles on development sites. So by way of introductions, Robin is a technical director here at RSK Biocensus. He's over 20 years of experience in ecological consultancy. He's got a background in protected species ecology and ecological impact assessment, and he's worked on a broad range of development projects across many sectors. So Robin's worked with reptiles throughout his career, so this includes research projects on the use of road verges by reptiles and the effectiveness of reptile mitigation measures. He's contributed to industry advice, including for English Nature, as was back in the day, and Highways England. His work on the reptile advice element of the design manual for roads and bridges drew on his experience of reptile research and survey work on road verges. And this work developed highway specific advice, but was later applied in other contexts. Okay, so if we could just go to the housekeeping slide. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. So microphones will be muted throughout the talk, but you can ask questions via the questions box that you'll see on your screen. And please do so. We should have time at the end for some Q&A. And if you've attended these before, you will know that shortly after the end of the session, we'll send a short questionnaire. And if you've got a few minutes to provide some feedback, we do appreciate it. It helps to understand what works and what doesn't with these webinars and what you, our industry colleagues, would like from them in the future. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Robin to tell us about managing reptiles on development sites, challenges for developers and consultants. So over to you, Robin, fire away.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Okay. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about reptiles and mainly in relation to mitigation measures for development. I thought I'd start with a really quick intro slide about what the reptiles we have are. So in the UK, we've got 6 species. There are 3 snakes along the top, 3 lizards along the bottom, adder, grass snakes, smooth snake, common lizards, slow worm, and sand lizard. So the green line separates the 4 on the left, which are generally considered to be the widespread species, and the 2 on the right are the rarer ones. Widespread doesn't actually mean that the reptiles are common in all areas. It just simply means it refers to their distribution. So the rarer species have really restricted distributions. They have really specific habitat requirements. So they're found in only a few places. I should note, in the UK, if we consider Northern Ireland, they only have 1, they have the common lizard. So why do we care about reptiles? This table is based on the IUCN criteria to assess extinction risk. So while some of our species are of least concern, which means there's no current risk of extinction, we do have 3 that are of conservation concern. Although species that might be listed as least concern, they still do have threats that face their survival in the wild, and they are still vulnerable to a degree from things like development impacts. There are a variety of criteria used to define the terms set out here in the table. So near threatened is a species that may have a 10% chance of becoming extinct in the next 100 years, or which may have had a population reduction of 50% or more in the past 10. Endangered, the highest level on this chart, is a species that may have a 20% or higher risk of becoming extinct in the next 20 years, or populations which have seen a 70% reduction in the last 10. I'm going to talk about legal protection in a moment, but what I would say is to spare a thought for adder on this table. We can see it's classed as vulnerable in England, which makes it more threatened than the great crested newt, which is of least concern across the whole of Great Britain. But adders receive far less legal protection. it's suggested to be at risk of extinction within 30 years in England, and adder population in many counties are on the brink of extinction. So we need to give them some consideration to how we can best protect their populations wherever we can. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about threats. Here are 6 factors which affect the status of reptiles. We've got intensification of agriculture, construction and development projects, transport corridors, both old and new, changing climate, which might include drought and wildfire, and changes to or the absence of land management. So how do these affect reptile populations? We have a few key issues cropping up. We have habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, degradation of habitats, predation, disease, and mortality. The wildfire picture up in the top right was a wildfire on the Isle of Arran from earlier this year, which just to kind of underline the impact that these increasingly frequent events can have. In the aftermath of that fire, there were 72 slowworms, 25 adders, and 14 common lizards found to be dead. The one in the bottom right, you might find a strange one. So we have the change, absence of management. So it's natural succession, if you like. So why are we saying that is a threat to reptiles? Well, ironically, some of the problems in critical habitats, such as heathland and dunes, have arisen because traditional management techniques have been abandoned. So the reptiles are then hit with this double whammy of major habitat loss and fragmentation, squeezing them into smaller and smaller areas, but then the natural succession of vegetation through overshading, for example, overshading by tree cover, reduced prey availability, or the drying out of wetland sites, is then leading to further population declines in those areas that we thought maybe were strongholds for them. So on my final why do we care slide, another reason we care about reptiles is that they're protected species. The widespread species receive partial protection in Great Britain, only against killing or injury. Wording of the legislation in Northern Ireland is slightly different, as they're only reptile species. They have effectively made common lizards have the same protection as EPS. EPS means European Protected Species. So these have a much higher level of protection. You can see there that it doesn't just involve offences in relation to killing and injury, but also capture, disturbance, taking and destroying eggs, relates only to sand lizard there, destroying or damaging a breeding site or resting place, obstructing structures that are used for shelter or protection, and possessing, controlling and transporting. All of the species are also protected against other things, including sale, but I haven't covered those here. They're not really relevant in a development scenario. In addition, at the bottom there, we have priority species. So all reptiles are priority species. That's to say they're listed as being of principal importance for the conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. Different pieces of legislation put that in place in all 4 countries in the UK, but they're all broadly the same wording. The biodiversity duty placed upon public bodies such as planning authorities, National Grid, Network Rail and others means that they need to take account of biodiversity when going about their business, and reptile species that are of principal importance are important to that. Last of all, reptiles also appear on local biodiversity action plans. Of course, that varies from place to place of what's included. So coming back to the topic of managing reptiles on development sites. I'm not going to talk about how or when we survey for reptiles, except to say that reptile surveys are not as easy as they might first seem. As with most small animals, the majority of reptiles are prey for anything larger than themselves, so they spend a lot of time hidden. And all reptiles are cryptic or camouflage, so they really aren't easy to find. We can't observe them from vantage points like birds, trap them easily like newts, or find permanent evidence of them in the landscape like a badger set. It takes skill and patience, and surveys need to be carried out at the appropriate times of year and when the weather is just right. So talking about surveys could be a separate topic in its own right, so I'm going to move quickly on and talk about the types of sites we might find reptiles in. So in short, reptiles could turn up in almost any type of project. Sites which have been unmanaged for some time, perhaps derelict industrial sites, or sites which only receive infrequent management might support the largest populations of reptiles. Reptiles are generally long-lived but rather sedentary species, so that sites which are connected to or have only recently been isolated from other suitable habitats are the most likely places that will support them. So if your development site was adjacent to a river corridor or was on the edge of heathland or rough pasture, it may be more likely to have reptiles than if it was in an arable landscape or an intensely urban area. So although I listed transport projects as a threat earlier, because these can easily create barriers to prevent animals from moving between habitats, interestingly, there are some parts of the transport network which are a haven for reptiles. And they can commonly be encountered in suitable habitats on highway verges and adjacent to railways. These kinds of areas are fairly infrequently managed, but they're rarely allowed to become completely overgrown. So there's very little direct disturbance, as access by people or pets or livestock is very rare. The ecotone between shrub and grassland, which is common in almost all verges and line-side habitats, is particularly favourable for reptiles. And when it's situated on a sunny south-facing embankment or on a cutting slope, we might have created an ideal conditions for reptiles. When working on the A31 dual carriageway in the New Forest, as it passes through heathlands in this photo here, we observed how road verges were actually providing a greater quality of habitat than the surrounding area. There were 5 species present here, the 4 widespread species and smooth snake. They did have suitable habitat on the adjacent land, but much of that had been overgrazed, and only the road verges and even the central reservation, when it was very wide, provided continuous band of structurally diverse vegetation that provided features for foraging, basking, and presumably hibernating, although we didn't study that, and opportunities for them to disperse up and down the road. This means that projects on existing infrastructure are not immune from reptile constraints, and upgrade work such as re-signalling or telecom schemes, or regular activities such as drain and ditch maintenance need to consider the potential for reptiles, including the rare species such as smooth snake. In many projects, the first time a client will encounter the issue of reptiles will be within a preliminary ecological appraisal. In most cases, the presence of reptiles will not have been confirmed because surveys to inform the PEA would not generally extend to reptile surveys. Within the PEA, the ecologist will have to consider whether a survey is required to fully assess the impact of the proposed development. And usually this will be the case if a significant area of habitat or specific habitat features which may be used by reptiles will be affected. The scope of the study should be proportionate to the potential negative effects of the development. This might mean surveying for habitat quality and extent, undertaking presence and absence surveys, or population estimates, potentially including recording of individuals through photo ID that can then be tracked later following translocation. Decision makers such as planning authorities should expect for surveys to be completed prior to submission of planning documents, as without these it's not possible for them to consider the effects of the proposed development on the species. Ecological impact assessment, whether as part of a formal EIA, will describe the impacts and their effects on reptiles, and then go on to define the mitigation and compensation measures necessary to offset those effects. Some key impacts for reptiles on development projects are listed here. So things we've already mentioned as their threats, really. So moving on from the impact assessment, thinking about hierarchy of mitigation. We should always follow the mitigation hierarchy when developing those mitigation measures. And in relation to reptiles, here are some key points of what that means. So to avoid possible effects on reptiles, developers could redesign development proposals to change the layout or not develop the areas which are used by reptiles. They might change the timing of the work or change the working methods. We should also think about the effects of habitat fragmentation here and consider whether a scheme can be designed in such a way to avoid or minimize this. The mitigation, it's seen as it's intended to reduce the impacts that can't first be avoided. So it's the second step. It might include preventing access to the development site through the use of fencing or displacing reptiles through gradual vegetation clearance. If there's no reasonable alternative habitat close by, the development may need to capture reptiles and move them to a different location. The new habitat must be capable of supporting reptiles, so this may need to be created or enhanced before the development works can begin. And then the last one, bottom left, we've got compensation and finally enhancement. Compensation is the replacement of an ecological feature which will be lost. So this relates to creating new habitats or habitat features to replace those which are going to be lost to the development site. Importantly, management of any newly created habitats is going to be necessary to ensure they remain suitable for reptiles in the long term. Occasionally, permanent fencing may be used where there is a perceived risk of reptile mortality associated with operational phase of the development. For example, that might be relevant at hotspots of road mortality. What I'd like to talk about for the rest of the session is to run through a few commonly used mitigation measures and discuss some of the evidence which does or doesn't underpin them and what drives us to carry those measures out with or without that evidence of their effectiveness. Scientific studies on reptile conservation measures and literature reviews searching for evidence of effectiveness have been scathing about the ability of the ecological consultancy sector and development projects to make meaningful contributions to reptile conservation. In their 2023 study, which considered the success of reptile translocation in Australia, Bradley commented that in many parts of the world, translocation success is identified by legislators and policymakers as the release of animals. But from the perspective of biodiversity conservation, releasing the animals is just the start, and success needs to be regarded as the ongoing survival and persistence of the translocated individuals and the establishment of self-sustaining populations. I think it's undoubtedly the case that we need to strive to achieve more from our mitigation projects, but mitigation also needs to be proportionate and pragmatic. It's true to say that some projects are solely concerned with avoiding legal offences and do not have a wider conservation agenda. This is particularly the case for small maintenance projects, which exist outside of formal consultation or the planning system. Those projects might be delivering a critical need, maybe within a tight time frame, and mitigation for reptiles just has to ensure that none are killed or injured. I'm not talking about projects affecting European protected species because their level of protection is a higher bar and licensing would be needed, which would ensure scrutiny from the nature conservation body. But in general, these smaller projects which only address the legal concerns tend to be those with a very small footprint. They don't tend to be projects which are likely to have any adverse effects at population levels. So on the next few slides, I'll describe some of the commonly applied mitigation measures. Displacement is generally used as a means to push reptiles from a small development area to adjacent retained habitats. As a concept, it only works if the retained area is of similar or better habitat quality, and that the area to be cleared is not likely to support significant numbers of animals. It is, I believe, a widely applied practice, but it's not a prescribed measure in any published guidelines. Natural England, within their withdrawn mitigation guidelines from 2011, did mention using this, and Natural England's standing advice for planners still does. I'm not sure if any evidence to suggest displacement exists. Evidence to suggest the beneficial consequences of displacement exists. But this is one of the types of measures which is really addressing a legal constraint and it isn't intended to provide long-term conservation benefits. I'm also unsure about its adverse effects in the long term. Clearly, it is possible for this kind of work to injure reptiles, but it comes down to how it is implemented. This type of work is always supervised by an ecologist on site, and it comes down to them to instruct vegetation clearance teams, to check areas for the presence of reptiles, and to monitor that throughout. Be a bit reactive to what happens on site and what is found. Displacement is only appropriate over short distances, so not for clearing the entire site. In the absence of guidance, what's an acceptable width to clear is left to professional judgment. There's a clue here, and similar to that photo on the screen, perhaps for a slow worm, a pragmatic limit for displacement would be a strip of habitat not more than 10 meters wide. The phased removal of vegetation in areas of very high quality habitat are generally undertaken over more than one day prior to the start of construction, so that we can provide opportunities for reptiles that were at ground level to emerge and to escape. However, in poorer or scrub-dominated habitats, it's often possible to be much more confident that there are no reptiles present as soon as that initial cut has been carried out and there is bare ground underneath. And in such cases, the second cut can proceed directly after the first. Destructive search. So destructive search is a means of proving the absence of reptiles from a specific habitat feature. To my mind, this is another of those mitigation measures which is aligned with avoiding offences for the widespread species, rather than being undertaken with the aim of delivering a longer-term conservation benefit. The approach has the potential to kill or injure reptiles, and therefore it's only to be used in situations where this can be shown to be unlikely. Examples of such situations might be following a comprehensive capture and translocation, in habitats that are suboptimal or where it's not been possible to confirm that they were absent through surveys, or where the work's footprint is sufficiently small that the presence of a reptile within that specific area is unlikely and other mitigation measures wouldn't be practicable. So examples of those such small sites we're talking about there would be installing electrical cabinets beside a railway or installing a new road sign on a road verge. Destructive search needs to be targeted at specific features in the habitat that are considered likely to be used by reptiles. So they're not intended to clear large areas. They should be undertaken gradually, starting with vegetation clearance and a hand search before any physical destructive work is undertaken. And it shouldn't be undertaken when reptiles are hibernating, because disturbance during that period would have a far greater risk of death. As with displacement, this is an often used approach which doesn't seem to have any basis in guidelines, or current guidelines, should I say. Methods for destructive search were described in the design manual for roads and bridges back in the day, but that has now been withdrawn. And Natural England's own withdrawn guidelines described the practice as potentially harmful and unproductive, but that nevertheless acknowledged that it had its place at the end of a thorough capture programme. For another example is of where destructive search is endorsed in guidance is that it's an accepted practice in relation to great crested newts. In their English Nature's guidance in relation to newt mitigation, it does stress that it should only be used once other methods have been exhausted. Considering evidence about whether this is an effective measure or not, I'm not sure that there are many studies or papers on this, but it's clearly been worth it if you find a reptile and it was unharmed and you can release it to a safe place. But I am sure there will be many cases out there where reptiles have been killed or injured using destructive search. So we have to ask, does that mean we shouldn't use it? I don't think it does. I think it would be irresponsible and it would be unlawful to undertake a destructive search where the killing or injury of a reptile was practically certain. But when all other efforts have been used to capture or discourage reptiles from the site, undertaking a destructive search mops up any of the remaining reptiles that might otherwise be harmed, or it confirms the absence of reptiles, which then gives the green light for construction works to proceed. So I think it does have its place, but it needs to be applied carefully. Translocations are probably the most contentious topic in reptile conservation circles. They have been shown to have a relatively good chance of success in a conservation setting, an example of which may be the number of sand lizard reintroductions that have successfully re-established populations in England. But evidence of their success in the mitigation setting is less convincing. So let's just consider the difference between these two things. On the face of it, they sound very similar. They're both ecologists moving reptiles from one place to another. But why are these different translocations having different outcomes? Conservation translocations are driven by demand. The idea that we would establish a viable population in a new location with the aim of conserving that species. There is a focus on establishing the new habitats, and it's likely that the receptor site will be one that is intended to be managed for nature conservation in the long term. Consideration can be given to the optimum number of animals to release, perhaps using population viability analyses, including the appropriate sex ratio and life stages for the species concerned. Perhaps individuals from different donor sites will be chosen to improve genetic diversity. The translocation doesn't actually need to go ahead until everything has been evidenced and checked, because its entire purpose is to move those animals to start that new population. On the other hand, mitigation-driven translocations are supply-driven. There is a finite number of animals which must be moved from the development site, whether they make up a suitable founder population or not. They might already be suffering from low genetic diversity, or might have, for example, very few juveniles due to some recent environmental event that destroyed a breeding site in the previous year. There may be more than one species involved, with different population sizes, different age structures, and different habitat requirements to accommodate. And then there is timescale. Rarely do development projects have sufficient time to create the perfect receptor site, or choose a location which has good connectivity to further suitable habitat. Only the very largest of the developments tend to achieve anything close to this. Another important note is that receptor sites tend to be off-site. And unlike conservation-driven projects, the receptor sites are not the main priority of the development. So you could argue that that shouldn't matter, and the ecologists and the project teams must make that a priority. But in reality, the project's being driven by other priorities, which then may override the long-term conservation benefits. Once the legal protection and planning obligations have been addressed and additional monitoring objectives have been delivered, the long-term maintenance of those sites it may then be in doubt. Even for the most expertly planned and executed mitigation translocation, common reasons for failure could include low population size, poor habitat quality and connectivity of the receptor site, predation, whether through introduced species such as pheasants or from domestic cats. And perhaps the hardest one for the consultant to deliver, as I've just mentioned, the long-term management of the receptor site to maintain it in a condition that benefits reptiles. Yes, we'd all like our receptor sites to be rewilded and have minimum intervention, but when the site we're working on is a field behind a supermarket, that's just not the game that we're in. Everyone needs to understand that the long-term management of that site is the only way to artificially maintain the reptile species in that location for perpetuity. So, with all the reasons for failure and all the evidence against, should we still do translocations? I think the answer is still going to be yes. They have a place in the mitigation hierarchy. Once impacts have been formally assessed, and if impact avoidance isn't feasible, a translocation remains one of the only ways to mitigate the impacts of a project. We can all acknowledge that carrying out the mitigation in the way that we do now and have done for the last couple of decades might change with changes in legislation. But species as rare and threatened as sand lizard, smooth snake or adder, it's really hard to conceive that any environmental delivery plan would not require individuals to be moved. Their rarity and the specific habitat requirements they have mean that offsetting approaches such as district level licensing, now mainstream for newts, would be impossible to replicate for reptiles. So if we are going to do one, how do we do it? First of all, let's assume we already have good survey data from the development site so we know what we're dealing with. Next, we need to select a receptor site. Ideally, it should have no reptiles present. This in itself might be hard to prove unless you're creating it from scratch. If a habitat is suitable but apparently devoid of reptiles, then we need to ask, what are the reasons that reptiles are not already present, so that we can make sure we address those factors before we begin the translocation. Often it's feasible to devote a portion of your development site to become a receptor area, and this provides obvious benefits. It's generally the preferred option because although we know reptiles are present, it's within the same populations range, so there are unlikely to be any genetic or disease considerations to worry about. In particular, where there are only small numbers of reptiles to be moved, this gets around the problem of having too few reptiles to start a new population on a new site. Importantly, some species, such as adders, appear to be closely linked to traditional hibernation sites, and relocating them to non-adjacent areas is almost never going to be appropriate, or would require a major project. What about the negatives of on-site receptor sites? We should assume that reptile habitats are already occupied to their current carrying capacity, so we need to ensure there is sufficient habitat enhancement undertaken to make sure the number of reptiles moved from the donor area can be accommodated in the receptor. This might be relatively straightforward for schemes with a small works footprint, such as a wind turbine in an extensive area of upland heath, but it's not likely to be feasible for a project that requires a large permanent land take in a landscape dominated by agriculture or urban areas. To address one of the key failure points from our previous slide, we should address the issue of long-term receptor site management. This needs to be built into any licenses, legal agreements, or planning conditions to ensure the availability of suitable habitats for reptiles into the future. The habitat management plan should include provisions to amend management techniques based on monitoring surveys to adapt the measures in the face of unexpected circumstances. There will be costs involved in all of this, and these need to be understood and funds agreed before works begin. Consideration should also be given to predator control. Exclusion fencing might be necessary to prevent reptiles from moving into the donor site as you try to trap them out. And it's been shown by Nash in 2021 that translocated adders, particularly males, increased their movements and home range size and were capable of unidirectional movements back towards the donor site. And that, as he pointed out, put them at significant risk from construction works. Once everything is set, the capture operation begins, and it's undertaken using a combination of direct searching for reptiles and the use of artificial refuges. These would normally be deployed at a higher density than normally used for a survey. All staff involved in translocations should be familiar with best practice guidelines on biosecurity and take measures to avoid the spread of disease, such as snake fungal disease. The very work to conserve or rescue the species could inadvertently spread the disease which kills them, and there is evidence in the literature which points to failures in amphibian translocations for this very reason. HGBI's 1998 guidelines are the only current guidance on translocation, following withdrawal of other guidelines such as DMRB and Natural England. Prepared before ecological consultancy was as mainstream as it is today, the advice about timescales for translocation appear to be rather onerous when you start to cost up the hours and days of time spent doing it. But given the lack of evidence for mitigation project success, it seems reasonable to use their precautionary approach as a sensible starting point. It's going to take time. HGBI prescribes that for a medium population of slow worms, it would require captures on all suitable days between March and September, or a minimum of 70 suitable days. Actual timescales might be varied using experience and professional judgment, and for species such as common lizard that are readily found using artificial refuges, there's probably a balance to be struck between reducing the number of days of effort and increasing the number of refuges used. Difficulties can occur in capture operations as they approach the end of the year. In late September, for example, because of the onset of the hibernation period. It's important to ensure that capture rates decline due to a dwindling population as you move them, rather than being due to the animals becoming less active and going into hibernation. Large populations may require trapping over 2 consecutive seasons, so developers need to be aware to program a winter break between October and March and respond to weather conditions if necessary. And finally, my final point here, all studies relating to reptile conservation and mitigation translocation endorse the delivery of post-construction monitoring surveys to assess the success of the project. This is where clearly defined objectives will come in handy. So if we can clearly define the objectives of the project, of the mitigation measures, we can demonstrate whether each objective has been achieved or not. In order to demonstrate the survival of individuals in the years following a translocation, projects should collect individual recognition, photo ID data prior to and during the translocation, and then review that again in monitoring surveys after construction. In these cases, a simple assessment of just assessing the population size wouldn't provide the evidence of success. Okay, so where does that leave us? I know I haven't really scratched the surface of the complexity of reptile ecology and how, you know, the complexities of delivering mitigation solutions on development projects that can then provide genuine conservation benefits. But I've tried to sum up a few points which I think here are equally applicable to you, whether you're a commercial ecologist or a client or a contractor faced with a population of reptiles on their site. To help mitigation projects raise the bar, my final thoughts would be that all mitigation projects should set those clear objectives to make sure everyone involved understands what they are aiming for and can measure whether they got there or not at the end. Investment in better survey data allows for better decision making, and where translocations are concerned, surveys to evaluate donor sites and receptor sites in as much detail as possible will help decisions to be made in the best interests of reptiles. We shouldn't expect translocations to be undertaken quickly. They're not an easy exercise, and ensuring that initial ecological appraisals are undertaken at an early stage of the project lifestyle will then allow us to plan them better and have more time to deliver the mitigation works. a key point there is making sure that we've got time to create a receptor site that then can establish and be ready to accept the reptiles as we move them. Natural succession of habitats is one of the key threats facing reptiles in the UK. So management of the receptor sites in the long term is necessary to maintain reptile populations in the locations that we've been chosen, or we've been given, or we've chosen to put them in. And lastly, skipped over it. Lastly, the industry needs some guidelines to follow. Many of our guidelines have been withdrawn, and we're relying back on some slightly outdated guidelines in some cases. So it's not practical to search scientific literature and make sure that the consultants undertake really detailed studies for every single project. We need guidance, some simple rules for them to follow. But those rules need to be prepared. They need to be well researched. They need to be species specific, and they need, wherever possible, to be underpinned by empirical evidence. Okay, thanks very much. Hand back to Gav. That's the end of this presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. If you want to pop your camera back on. Yeah, thanks so much for an excellent overview. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that reptiles are one of the most commonly encountered constraints, ecology constraints on development sites, and maybe requiring some of the most nuanced decisions for consultants, but without really much of an evidence base, or, as you mentioned, even guidance to inform decisions. So yeah, it's a tricky combination for consultants. We've got a few questions, and we've got a little bit of time left, so we've got time for a couple. I'll dive into them. I'm going to pick on this one first because it's talking about translocation, which you finished on. In your experience, how long does post-translocation monitoring / habitat management for reptiles usually go on for? And do developers commit to doing it if they don't have the local planning authority breathing down their neck on it? I.e., can you as the ecology consultant get them to pay you for monitoring and remedial management if they have no comeback?
It's a good question. Yeah, I do think monitoring is not done enough and not done for long enough, and I can hold my hand up on the projects that I've been involved in too to say that it is the case no matter what your intentions. I would say in the projects I've been involved in, only the very largest projects would go on for 10 years. And that's, example of that would be something like, going back a long time, the M6 toll, that had a 10-year monitoring program following translocations. I can imagine other major projects like HS2 and nuclear new build projects would have the same, but many projects won't be able to achieve that. 5 years, I think, would be optimistic for most projects. I dare say there are many that have only 1 year. I think it's important to make sure that, as I mentioned, objectives. I think you need to set out what those monitoring measures, what the monitoring surveys are going to achieve. Once you've set out the success criteria for your project, then it should be fairly clear that that's what you need to then survey to demonstrate against success. I just thought another point in terms of timeline, just the kind of the longevity of species, their response to being moved mean they may not breed immediately when they reach the site, or we don't often know what's going on at the population level. So yeah, short-term monitoring may not be able to capture success. So yeah, the longer the better is probably the argument. It always is, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's at the root of one of the issues that we have in the industry, which is there hasn't been enough monitoring, and we don't, and that's one of the reasons of that we don't have a good evidence base to understand, you know, what are the outcomes of these actions that we're taking.
If that monitoring can be built in early recommendations, then that does give the planning authorities a little bit of something to latch onto and to include in your you know, in your planning conditions. So I guess that it comes down to a little bit, can we make some clear recommendations early that then allow the regulators to pull those out if they wouldn't have done so otherwise themselves.
Yeah, thank you. So I've just noticed that we are actually slightly over our endpoint. I'm going to carry on for just a few minutes for those who want to hang on this call, and then I'll wrap it up, and then we'll probably have to come back to people afterwards with any of the outstanding questions. So I'll grab another couple of questions before we finish up though. There's one here which is it possible, actually, sorry, it's on the evidence side of things again. I think that would be relevant. If you could identify one key knowledge gap to address to improve how we deal with reptiles on development sites, then what would it be? It's putting you on the spot.
That's a really good one. Maybe it is around their habitat requirements and the quality of habitat that they require. It's really hard to, well, when you create a habitat, obviously it takes many years to develop, you know, dense tussocky grassland and a mixture, you know, a mosaic of different types of habitat. So knowing exactly what the reptiles need will allow us to make more successful receptor sites. So understanding their habitat requirements, I think, is the key.
Okay, that's fine. Can you still hear me, by the way? Because I've noticed some strange things happening on my screen.
Yeah, you're frozen. Oh, you've gone completely, but I can hear you.
Okay, I will play on in audio only. There we are, yeah. Okay, one here is it possible to use off-site biodiversity net gain compensation sites as off-site receptor sites for reptiles?
I think it certainly should be. The advantage of net gain sites and net benefit sites in Wales are that they are required to be there for 30 years. So there is that long-term view, which is so important. There has been a bit of advice published in Practice in December last year, I think it was, of how to incorporate or how to consider reptiles when looking at your BNG and proposing your habitat creation. So that's one to go and look at in practice.
There we go, top tip, that's great, thank you. And I'm going to pick one more because we're quite a bit over, and then we'll wrap it at that. So okay. How can reptile receptor sites be better protected post-development? Often these can be forgotten, particularly if not managed in an appropriate manner, and then become vulnerable to new development.
Yeah, it's another tricky one. I think, well, if I can link those two questions, if there is an opportunity to incorporate them in sites which are then protected under some other covenant for 30 years, then obviously that's a good win. I think with some of the kind of the major translocations for the really large projects, it's whether we can bring in other organizations that can manage sites, take on sites, be employed to deliver those management activities in the long term. And I'm thinking about, you know, wildlife trusts and organizations like that have you know, have those skills and would prioritize the management of those sites. So it comes down perhaps to how the developer feels about handing over responsibility for things, setting up legal agreements. But yeah, it is a problem. I think something to discuss with with the developers and the planning authorities for those types of projects.
Great, thank you. We're 5 minutes over our endpoint, so I'm going to wrap it up at that. There's a few more, no worries. There's a few questions outstanding, and we will follow these up afterwards. Yeah, so it just leaves me to say a big thanks, Robin, for that. That's been great, and thanks to everyone for attending. One for the calendars, our next session will be on November the 6th. Topic still to be confirmed, and we will circulate that once we've finalised the details. And on that note, it's goodbye. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.